All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Joshua Gorman. I'm the Executive Director of Harvard's collection of historical scientific instruments. With Faculty Director Hannah Marcus, I want to welcome everyone here to the Historic Science Center, where we invite you to join us in exploring what we know and how we came to understand it. With this vision in mind, I am delighted to welcome you to tonight's conversation, co-sponsored by the Campus Curator's Office, the David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies, and Harvard's Museums of Science and Culture. We're honored to have visual artist Nancy Friedman Sanchez and Professor Pablo Gomez speaking with us tonight. They'll be in conversation with Harvard professor Gabriela Soto La Vega, speaking about the power and bias of measurements. Gabriela is professor of the history of science and Antonio Madero professor of the study of Mexico at Harvard University. Through her award-winning scholarship and remarkably prestigious positions and fellowships, Gabriela seeks to resuscitate Latin America as a historical site for scientific research and technological innovation. Most recently, she was elected to the Academia Mexicana de la Historia, one of the highest honors for a historian of Mexico, especially for one operating outside the country. I was privileged to watch Gabriela and her exceptional team of students curate the Measuring Difference exhibition that has sparked this conversation tonight. I'll now turn this over to Gabriela, who will contextualize tonight's discussion and introduce our panel. Gabriela.
Thank you so much, Josh, for that really lovely introduction. And I want to say a couple of things, but before I do, I want to mention the names of the students who were on the team who helped me, and Kathy Enright, Manny Medrano, and Francis Newman, without whom the exhibit would not have been possible. And the idea for this exhibit came about from a memory of reading 16th century reports of the Spanish conquistadores to the Spanish king and queen. In these letters, they used the term mundos novus, new world, to attempt to describe and document what was before their eyes. They explained that they lacked the words to appropriately convey what they were seeing. Most were sailors or soldiers familiar with foreign lands, and yet they made the Americas seem different. From that point forward, new measures were used and words invented to show that the flora, the fauna, and especially the humans of the Americas were significantly different to anything found back in Europe. Measures were invented to show these differences. This is one of the core takeaways from this exhibit. What we presume to be objective, a standardized measurement, is in fact a human invention. Many of these measures were used to exclude a practice that continues to this day. Today, we have brought together a historian of medicine and an artist to speak about these themes from their own practice. It is through these interdisciplinary conversations that we can understand how others perceive the world and hopefully understand how they got to that point. If that is our goal, to understand how difference is created and thought of, we are incredibly fortunate to have these two individuals in conversation tonight. Pablo Gomez is one of the most influential and intellectually exciting historians in the field of history of medicine. His influence extends geographically well beyond the Caribbean, his regional site of expertise, and the early modern period when he chronologically situates himself. The source of this influence is his inventive approach to research, which expands our understanding of the practice of medicine as it exists entangled with race, racism, and power in the Americas. Professor Gomez was a practicing orthopedic surgeon in Bogotá, Colombia, when he opted to trade in his white lab coat for the much more lucrative field of professor of history. He obtained his PhD from Vanderbilt University in 2010 and is currently associate professor in the Department of Medical History and Bioethics, as well as the History Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. His first book, Experiential Caribbean, won some of the leading prizes in our profession, including the Welch Medal from the American Association of History of Medicine and the Rabateau Best Book on Africana Religions. His second monograph, Bloody Numbers, slave trading, and the invention of modern corporeality in early Iberian Atlantic, which will be out in about a year or later this year, is certain to also sweep these awards. Nancy Friedman Sanchez is a Colombian-American contemporary artist whose stunning Loba Garífuna was commissioned for the exhibition. Really, if you have not seen it, you can't leave this building without taking a look in the exhibition to see what she created. A multimedia artist, she examines themes of identity, migration, and cultural hybridity in her work. Nancy studied at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogotá, Colombia, before moving to New York, where she lived for almost 20 years, but now she resides in Nebraska. She was the 2020 recipient of the Catherine Doctorow Prize for Contemporary Painting and has had multiple solo shows, including at the Utah Museum of Contemporary Art. And I'm just gonna list a few because the list goes on for pages. The Salt Lake City Museum, the Halsey Institute for Contemporary Art in Charleston, the Nerman Museum of Art in Sioux City, the Sioux City Art Center, the Museum of Contemporary Art in North Miami, the Columbus Museum of Art, as well as exhibitions in Ecuador, Bolivia, Panama, and Colombia. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have her because she has a solo show opening in New York this evening at the Instituto de Visión, but we were fortunate that she opted to come here to talk to us about the craft and making of art and intertwining it with history. So before we begin our conversation, Pablo and Nancy will speak for about 8 minutes, maybe 10. I will be very draconian with the time. And then we will have a conversation before we open it up to questions from the audience. And with that, I'd like to help me welcome Pablo Gomez to the podium.
Well, I want to start by thanking Diana, Gabriela, Josh, the Harvard Museums, the David Rockefeller Center, and everybody involved in bringing us together. I'm very excited. This is a conversation that I've been looking for several months. And thank you also for coming, both here in person and those that are joining in online. It's great to see many old friends and to get to know new people and to be in conversation with Nancy. And I'm very, very excited. I already learned a lot from you in the few moments that we have been talking. What I'm going to be presenting today, and I just wanted to give you a sense of where I'm coming from into this conversation, which is this book that Gabriela mentioned that I'm finishing is Bloody Numbers, Slave Trading, and Imagination of the Modern Human Body. And it is a book in which as Gabriela mentioned, I'm trying to imagine and think of what are the origins of these set of notions that many of us, I think, came to see as kind of normal, between quotes, or natural. The ways of thinking about the body as an entity that we can think in groups, that we can average, that we can measure risk. And I imagine many of you, even if you were not familiar with this, during the pandemic, the first thing that you did every morning was checking out your phone and see what are the curves of COVID that were coming that day, mortality rates, and obviously these sort of concepts, right, like that are at the center of biomedical thinking about corporality, public health, political economy. So these notions really are at the center of the ways in which human bodies are conceived or in our world. But there is nothing natural. This is what Gabriela was saying. There is nothing natural about thinking about human bodies in that way. And this specific history is one that, and I'm sure many of you know this, I've been told, and I'm just going to be mentioning, this is obviously something that's far broader. I just wanted to mention what is kind of the sort of space in which I think my work enters the conversation. So it's being imagined through narratives about, for instance, the Italian Renaissance and Comic Revolution, right? Like the identification of specific body parts, specific systems, organs. So from bodies that were immortal in nature or spiritually inhabited, we can see a body that is mechanized, right? Like, and then we can, where blood now circulates, right? Like for instance, the famous work of William Harvey. Obviously, this is also the time during the 17th century of the imagination of mind-body dualisms, the mechanicistic models for imagining the body. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because it is through these processes that we can think about the body as an object that can be objectively studied, that we can be seen. Obviously, this is also the time when the anatomical revolution also brings into different kinds of representing human bodies, in both in Italy, in the Netherlands. But it's also a place where we imagine disease as entities that can exist in the world on their own. I think that for us, it's normal to understand diabetes or cardiovascular disease as a concept. We know that these things somehow exist out there. That is something that for most people before the 18th century, even the 19th century, and many places, even in the 20th century, would have been something really weird to conceive. That you have something that we can call cancer, right? Or that we can call, as I mentioned before, diabetes. So we have the emergence of what is called nosology, and this is the work of some of the people associated with that field, Thomas Sideman, and later in the 18th century, Giambattista Morgani, and is the taxonomization, the organization of diseases, something that you can identify, and importantly, that you can then measure. This is an essential concept for the ability for you to create the studies that will later on, with the emergence of biomedicine in the 20th century, proper biomedicine, allow us to think about the bodies in which the ways we do today. And finally, in terms of that background, this is two of the other authors that figure prominently, especially in the history of quantification of human bodies, the work of John Brown with the Bills of Mortality, and William Petty, kind of the father of political arithmetics. And this is thinking about populations as groupable and measurable in many ways. Interestingly, I don't know if interestingly is the word, I was just like, strangely, is perhaps a better way of putting it, the largest enterprise dealing with human bodies, measuring human bodies, and taxonomizing and registering human bodies of the early modern era does not figure in this narrative. And obviously, it is the history of the transatlantic slave trade. We do know that the transatlantic slave trade is closely associated with the ideation of race, racial difference, the brutal and violent war of the African diasporic and the genocide of the slave trade is central to the imagination of conceptualizations of racism and human difference. We do know this. But it's different to think about the slave trade as being central to the ways in which all of our bodies came to be conceived. And this is, and I think this is the sort of thing that I'm interested in, is how these ideas that seem to be kind of, again, normative and somehow like beneficial actually have very violent origins, which also explain why, like, what I think is the violence that they perpetrate in creation of public health projects, in the creation of studies. There is something very profoundly violent about the imagination of bodies in these ways. And I think that the origins of the notions, and this is part of the genealogy, I'm going to make clear that this is not a unique kind of teleological narrative. There is something here about different origins that are emerging in this work. But the reality is that by the early 16th century and 17th century, people in the transatlantic, in the world of the transatlantic slave trade, most of them living not in London, not in Italy. This is not the history of the anatomical dissections of Bologna or Leiden. This is a history of slave trading huts, slave trading locales, and slave trading entrepots in West Africa, Cacheo, West Central Africa, Luanda, Sao Tome, Cabo Verde, Atlantic Islands, or places in the Spanish Caribbean, like Cartagena de Indias, the main slave entrepot in what today is Colombia, Puerto Rico, Hispaniola. The transatlantic slave trade and everything that kind of the ideation, the organization, really emerges out of these spaces in the Iberian Atlantic. I'm calling it Iberian not because the actors there were exclusively Iberian. As a matter of fact, people from all over Europe, from all over the Americas and Africa were already from the beginning investing and working in the slave trade. This included financiers in Florence, Venice, Amsterdam, communities in Madrid, in Lisbon, in Cadiz, in Seville, but also in Cartagena, in Havana, and in all these other spaces in Africa. These are international communities. And it is not a small number of people. Behind each one of the slave voyages that exist in their Cadiz, there were like dozens of people hiring captains to bring enslaved people, and behind each one of those investors, there were dozens of people at the same time. So one of the main arguments here is that there is a grammar, there is a language that is circulating in these spaces. In all of those metropoles in the 16th and 17th century, it flows, it creates abstract concepts like the Piazza de Indias that flow from Cartagena to Amsterdam to Lisbon. It is not a unique space that is secluded to communities or dozens or hundreds of people. We're talking thousands of people here. These people ideated not only abstract concept, but started thinking about mortality rates. This is an example of mortality rates in the Middle Passage of 10% in the early 17th century. They created, and this is, I was just shocked when I saw the vara as a unit of measurement, but not only as a unit. They created instruments for the standardization of human bodies, including, as I said before, the vara, with specialists in the calibration of those instruments, like the almotacen. They register these values, and this is important. We're not talking here about prices. We're talking about abstract concepts, deduction of abstract concepts, and valuation. These are two very different things. And the reason I mention this is because it allows for the registration. There is no other set of records that is as vast in the early registration of values of human bodies, measurement of human bodies, as those of the transatlantic slave trade, until the emergence of the public health projects in the 18th century. Again, this is what it is surprising, that this is not at the center of these narratives. And they also created an nosology, the same sort of thing that was mentioned before, thinking about disease as a separate entity, and they created nosologies for which they, in their own ways, I'm not saying that these are very sophisticated mathematical treatments, but they started measuring risk and thinking about risk in mathematical terms. This is, again, in the early 17th century. This is way, way before this is happening in the work of people like William Petty, John Ground. This is not unique, but these genealogies are very closely related to the way in which I believe our bodies came into being. And this is just, I just want to give you an example. Don't worry, I'm not going to go over these. This is an example of the complexity of the classifications that they created. I'll be happy to talk more about this in the conversation. And just to end, part of the invitation here is to think about this history as a history that created not only the vicious space of race and racism, but also the violence of the numbers that actually define our lives. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am delighted to be here and very grateful to Gabriela, to Josh, and to Diana Moon for this invitation to be part of this exhibit and of this talk. I will start by telling you a little bit about myself and my work. I am a visual artist from Bogota, Colombia, and I'm half American and half Colombian. And my work, the work that I'm presenting here to you, is the work of the last 10 years, where I am involved in what I call a visual novel. And it's a visual novel about cultural memory, about gender, about migration, and living in between two cultures, two languages, and it's about that space of existing between two worlds. This piece here, or pieces, is called Travelers and Settlers, and is a piece that I started when I moved to Lincoln, Nebraska, after living in New York for 20 years. So it was a space, its work, of where I bring, this is a piece here, the piece in front is, this is called Travelers and Settlers. Travelers, the front piece, and the back piece is Settlers. The back piece is made with pearls on paintings made with metal and painted with car paint and made with pearls. And the front is made of wood that I picked up in my walks in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I made these legs that I wanted to make seem like they were like part of a train. So it's train, it's water, it's the back are like portraits, genealogy. Pearls were part of the colonial extraction. This is a horseshoe from the conquistadores, a Tumacolatolita piece that I brought back from Colombia, and I placed it in the back. But the piece originated with a iron that was owned by my grandmother, and she had in her house in Tunja, Boyacá, Colombia. And so it's about history, it's about migration. And then after I did these works that were very personal, I dove into the casta paintings, and did research on the casta paintings, which were in the colony. They were a genre of painting that originated and were about the racial mixing that was occurring. And I was very interested, not because of the history, but what they meant to me in my own history and growing up in Bogotá, Colombia, and moving here, migrating to the US, and seeing that reflected in my day-to-day life and in the life that I left in Colombia and the problematics left there. This is the works installed at the Sioux City Arts Center. You can see 5 of those pieces. There are 16 pieces that were created in the colony, and I decided to make 16 of them. I invited different Latina women to my studio, and I had them pose in the shape that we all take when we stand in a TSA machine when we travel. So I created a relationship to the colony. And the masks I sourced from eBay using a Duchampian license of the ready-made, and I bought them, and I placed each one of them also with the Spanish peineta, the peinetas. My mother used to have 2, and I now think of them as this assertion of whiteness, of getting closer to Spain, denying your indigenous roots that we all have in Latin America. And so I created these works that represented all the different castas. The mask, I wanted to have both readings. I'm very interested in my work to have this place, this in-between place, just as I travel between languages, between cultures, between North and South, that the works they travel between domination and insubordination, that they're both, that they're places of resistance as well. This is, I asked my daughter to pose, and this is China. And China is also a term of endearment used in Colombia. I was called China as a child. I call my daughter China, and it's a racist term, and it's how we have all of these labels that we have used historically and how they exist in our language, in our bodies. As an artist, my job is to take my historical research and create a bridge to a place of poetry. The next piece, this is another body of work that I have been working on, and this is part of Cornucopia, and I have been working with María Ermelinda Ortega. She is an artisan from Pasto, Colombia, and she works in Barniz de Pasto, which is an ancestral practice that is about 1,000 years old and existed before contact and has survived for all of these years. So we have been, the plant grows in the Putumayo, and when the Spanish arrived, they were already in commerce with Asia, and they brought to the Americas, and to Europe, they were bringing lacquer, silk, porcelain, and of course taking the gold, the resources, and everything that they could take. And this series is called Cornucopia, and Cornucopianism is this term that speaks of the eternal resources that can be extracted infinitely. And these works and the flora and fauna that I have here is all researched in colonial Mopa Mopa or Barniz de Pasto. So every flower, every animal, every little piece that you see in these works I have looked at each one of these objects that I have photographed in museums, in books, in collections, and I brought it to the artisan and created these works of art that speak of that extraction and of that continuing war that we still have against the environment, against other humans. And this is done in Barniz de Pasto in Mopa Mopa. I make the works in my studio, and I send an image to her, and we work in some way transnationally. These are details. I make sculpture. So I have an interdisciplinary practice, and these are referencing painting. Again, I go back to that Duchampian license, and these are about painting, but they're stretchers. And on top of them, I've placed Amazon paintings, chanchamas, and peinetas, creating with these ready-mades those relationships of domination, of resistance. This is kill, super overkill. It's made with wood from my walks in Lincoln, Nebraska. The organs are made of stones that were drawn with lead pencil. The mask is a mask from the Amazon. This is part of Dream Map and Cornucopia. Again, thinking of the Manila Galleon and the travels of the Europeans going to Asia and coming back with goods. And the image here, you can see, for me, this is the history of the world. It's the history of extraction, of colonization, of capitalism. The bottom piece is taken from the Codex Duran and shows the moment of contact and an indigenous person with a molinillo to mix chocolate. Next, Europeans drinking chocolate, and the last, a botanical illustration of chocolate, but it could also be, it's branding, basically. The cacao pods. Another piece where I photographed a vessel in Fonarte in a store in Mexico City. The flowers come from colonial paintings, and I added green eyes and blue eyes to the figures. And here, what was very important to me is to see where those moments of domination, of resistance begin. So you have this little pot with the blue eyes, with, you could call it mestizaje, hybridity, syncretism, domination, and here too, the little nativity. But if you see the pot on the side, it has snake legs. And I think in those places is where you find resistance. Here, the text in this piece, I did a collaboration with the poet Farid Matuk, and Tasks That Don't Ask for Names. I'm referencing the novel of Jose Eustaquio Rivera, La Vorágine, which was about the rubber exploitation. And the images, the drawings are from Jan Chamas as well, and you can see the figures tied at the neck. This piece here, these are all 135 by 90. They're large scale, and that is very important for the work because it's about taking space. It's thinking of illuminated manuscripts of small works, but they are made very large. The flora here is coca leaves, and the figures you can see, they are inside of flames. I'm thinking of the Inquisition, of the burning of the Amazon, the deforestation, the demonization of the coca plant. The soldiers are cyclops. They have uni eyes, they're targets, but they target too. Then this piece, Dream Map and Cornucopia with potatoes, again with a text by the poet Farid Matuk. And it's an offering. The potato is South American. It's thinking of all of the elements of the colony. Now, this work is a work I did. I illustrated for a book by Manuel Zapata Olivella, a very important Afro-Colombian scholar and doctor and activist. And this was for Caro y Cuervo, which is an institution that safeguards Colombians' literary patrimony. And this was a book that went to many libraries, rural libraries in Colombia. I decided to make it in woodblock. It was not in collage or in painting, because the story is a story fraught with the internal conflict that Colombia has had. And I thought that the woodblock is you have to wound the wood in order to create an image. So I really wanted that poetic relationship between the wounding of the material and the story of wounds. And this last piece is a work I did for collectors in Lincoln, Nebraska, that have an aviation company, and I designed the interior and exterior of their plane. I have been interested in women's work, in feminism, and I thought that it was very appropriate to turn this phallic shape of this patriarchal industry and completely feminize it. The interior, very woomy, and including pink colors and embroideries and all kinds of elements that allude to the history of women's work. And then this is my last image. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nancy. Thank you so much, Pablo, for just giving us a teaser, a taste of the complexity of both of their works. And in this conversation, I'm going to try to get to a different layer of what they are showing in their work. And I'll be mindful of the time so that I will allow some time for us to ask questions as well. So I want to start with something that's really apparent in both of your works, and that is the question of violence. And violence is significant in both your work, Nancy, but also in what you research, Pablo. And it's often not so subtle, but it's also, both of you are from Colombia. And I was wondering if you could tie in your interest that really comes up, your research, Pablo, and your art, Nancy, and explain a little bit about that. Pablo, why don't we start with you, and then Nancy, we can come to you. And I'll be tapping you if you're going a little bit over.
Okay, I'm going to try to be short. I was just thinking about this when I saw Nancy's incredible images, and that some of the paintings, when you see both the ghosts behind the matorral, mata, and remember of this beautiful poem that came out last year. But also the flower, the beauty of the flower, the beauty of, but also the soldiers and all the violence behind, and it moved me to tears. And I hope that you don't mind me sharing this. and the reason being that there is the world in which we grew up, and Nancy and I live in that Colombia of the 1980s and 1990s. It stayed with me, right? Like, and it always will stay with me. And so I think that partially what happened with this book, I started seeing those records while I was doing research, even for my dissertation, and it just stayed with me. And it was a gut feeling. It was something that didn't leave me. It is just inside you, and you realize that the violence of the world in which you live, that is surrounded by all this exuberance and beauty, but deep down informs the reality of your everyday. And I think that is what has been in my mind. It took me only 20 years to come to terms with some of these notions, but I do think that, but certainly, I was just reflecting precisely on that question, Gabriela, when I was just watching these images, and I think they touch you, right, like in precisely the sort of way that only great art does, right? Like, and that we historians and intellectuals have to strive for years to put into words, right? But certainly, at least as a Colombian, somebody who grew up in that Medellin, we were talking about all the car bombs that she and I had to endure. But and that is nothing. I have to say this also, because it is true that, as a Colombian, there is this narrative of like, yeah, of course we live that, but nothing to the reality of the people that you represent, the campesinos, the people in the countryside, the ones in the receiving end of the massacres, we are privileged in many ways. And still, it haunts you. Yeah.
Thank you. And Nancy?
Well, I mean, I think everybody knows that Colombia is a violent country, and the propaganda is that Colombia is a violent country. And yes, many people have left it have migrated looking for more peaceful and more economic opportunities. I mean, but the U.S. is also violent, and I think I would like to, just put it on the table that it's not just the other, because that we also otherize ourselves, and we can otherize ourselves in our own work. But I think for me, violence is in my work because I grew up in Colombia, and violence is in my work because I felt the contrast arriving here. And when you migrate, I think migration contains violence in the fact that you are changing language, you are adapting to a different system. That in itself is to your own body is kind of uncomfortable, to say the least. But I would say that the violent part in my work is always countered with resistance. Just as I talk about the resistance in the pots from Michoacán, I think of resistance in my own work and in my own existence.
Can I respond just
please.
real quick, because I think this is so crucial what you just said, Nancy. I always also resisted kind of the representation of Colombia as a space of violence. And actually, my first book and a lot of my work was kind of a reaction to that. I was saying, like, there was in this space, the people that I studied, and it's the people on the receiving end of the records that I show you today. These people are people that created worlds. Mm-hmm. Intellectual creativity, incredible space in the midst of all this, which for me is also my country, right? Like in the midst of all that, there is incredible violence, happiness, and so I think that is a crucial point to make.
Thank you both for that those beautiful answers. And this is about narrative and how you create a narrative. And in your research, Pablo, and in your art, Nancy, you speak about the stories or experiences that you are highlighting. And could you elaborate on why you select specific stories or objects or traits, and why you navigate both in your work, Pablo, and in much of your art to some similar themes that keep coming up again? And Nancy, why don't you start off this time?
Well, I think both bodies of work that I presented here, the castas, I think they're narratives that we think of the casta paintings as, paintings from the, mid 1700s, but they exist, and they exist here. We are part of them. They are in our bodies. I mean, I was saying that I called my daughter China, and I was called China and Loba and all of these terms, the coyote, all of these labels that were ascribed in the colony, they're still used today in our current. There's even these narratives. There is even a song by Shakira that is called Loba. That uses the word loba and embraces that. And I think that has to do with caste. In terms of the cornucopia, we are in a world that is so much about extraction. It's a continuation of the colony. And I think those narratives are they're just so present. I mean, we think that we can replace everything with technological innovation, like AI. I mean, the amount of water that has to be used for AI, for example.
Yeah, I for me, right, like I've been thinking, as I said before, right, like these records, but also even in my own practice as a physician before, and in my own conversation with my colleagues, I perceive a certain kind of hunting, that there is a way in which there is a spectral presence. That is the way I've been thinking about it lately. And I've been trying to tell that story in a way that both signals to what is happening in this space, but also trying to recover, right, like the ways in which a lot of people, right, like were implicated in this, and I agree. It's like these are the stories of all of us. Both are perpetrators, right? Like it is easy to dissociate ourselves in our kind of 21st century liberal self, right, like from these histories, right? Like as much as we are also in the receiving end of them. So it is something strange, right, like to tell a history that is so imbricated in both ways. So I didn't want to tell a history that is also one of actors that are kind of seems to be far away from our own realities, and at the same time is understanding that the people have never received these dehumanizing processes passively, right? Like, and that we do that, they did that, enslaved people. I strive to create these narratives in which they understood the logics. This is their thing. Even and this is something that we know from the work of many historians of slavery. They understood the logics of these processes, and they used them for their own benefit, right? Like, and we do have the records that show that was the case. And so again, like for me, that's important. How the people survive and how people thrive in the worst conditions possible. It's also a lesson for us, I think, today.
I really love how you both are moving in both the past and the present, and you're finding these examples to say, we should be looking at what is happening here right now in both your work and I started with the question of Colombia provocatively to get us to think that it's not this space, that it's not confined to these ideas of creating difference. And I want to go there with this question, because I am emphasizing that this notion that measurements are inventions, but these inventions have such a lasting power, as you showed in the records of how the slaves were measured and how that counting of bodies and counting of body parts becomes such a part of our daily life today. And I'd like if you could both reflect on this notion of what the counting, what the arithmetic, what the measurements that were created in the colonial period and how they survived to this day. Go ahead.
One of the things that I wanted to also emphasize is also the materiality of these issues. I think that, I'm a historian of medicine, historian of science, so I live in my world of epistemes, and obviously the field itself has moved a lot into practice, which is the sort of thing that I was just telling, I was talking with Nancy before. There's a materiality to this history that is remarkable. I think that is partially the reason why this has kind of remained unseen, right? Like the haunting is partially because it is part of the spaces in which we measure, and that's what I was mentioning in the Vara, because it happened in the conceptualizations of things and beings together, in their representation, in the ideation, but this comes from the actual moving, touching. We have to remember these are profoundly violent processes that are happening with real human beings in real time in spaces that are populated by death and disease. And so that materiality and that sense of like being there present is very important, because this is also kind of that part of the hunting that is also visceral, right? Like, and that is so sometimes hard to kind of put out there. But measuring certainly so, right? Like measuring is necessarily, right? Like as much as a tool of taxonomization, organization, creation of difference, is something that is maturely done, and we cannot forget that.
So Pablo, can I just pause there because you've talked about the Vara, and I wonder if you could just explain a little bit more what the Vara is, because in the exhibit you will see a Vara. That is the first object that you will see when you walk in. But it's a very different Vara than the one that Pablo is referencing for the slave trade, because the Vara that you will see in the exhibit is a measuring stick, a rod, but that rod, for those of you who've been to the exhibit, was captured by the US invading army when it arrives to Mexico City. It's from 1848, when the US Army invades Mexico and gets there. And why would they take a rod? And what that rod measured was not measuring bodies, which is the one that Pablo's talking about, but it measured land. So for an invading army, it was very important to take back the measurement that Mexicans used to measure land, because what they were taking in the conquest of Mexico was the land that we now know as Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona, parts of Utah, Colorado, Oregon. So they needed the Mexican measure because that measure did not exist in the United States. And what you will see on the other side of the vara is that in 1880s, when Texas was already part of the United States, they're still using the measurement of a vara, even though the vara does not exist anywhere else in the United States. But the maps are made with the vara. So that's a very different vara than the one that you will see in the exhibit, because the one that you're talking is about measuring bodies. Could you just elaborate a bit?
This was
there?
used to standardize, and there was a standardized abstract unit that was called the Pieza de Indias by the middle of the 17th century. And they have this specific vara, that is very similar, at least in conceptualization, to use against every...
Pieza de Indias?
Pieza de Indias, right? Like that is the abstract unit, right? Like, and it was a male that measured what was called 7 cuartas, that is around 5'4", that without any disease between 18 and 35 years of age, right? Like that is kind of the standard around which everybody else, right? Like, and that is also the balance that is gender, et cetera, et cetera. It's going to be measured, but it's also going to be deducted. That is the value that you have. So you have this vara that measured the 7 cuartas, and that is the first thing that happens after you are coming out of the slave ship, and they're valuing you. Again, this is not pricing, they're valuing you. They will put you against the vara. From kids, we call muleques, mulequillos, mulecones, to women, and that is the first model process of standardization. They move you around if you are not, and then you are deducted, and then there's going to be all these deductions that will happen around diseases specifically, right? Like groupings related to gender and others. So it was the central instrument, right? Like of measuring in the middle of the trade. And I mean, again, happy to talk more about this. This also has to do with the measurements that were done for other sorts of things that were also carried around in slave ships. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for clarifying that. And Nancy, you can answer that question, but you said something very interesting when you were showing just how huge your art is. It occupies entire walls, an entire plane, inside and out. And you said something that really struck me, because you said it's about occupying space and about being comfortable in this space. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Okay, all right. But I do want to segue in from what you were saying. The piece that I made for the exhibition, I gave it a casta name, but I also gave it a last name. And I think the
Loba Garifuna.
Loba Garifuna. So it has a first name and a last name. And I would say that the last names also attach to the system of castas. And the last names in Latin America also function as a way of measurement and as a way of inclusion and inclusion. So that it had a last name with a very specific reason. And so so those exclusions sometimes are just very subtle, but they are there.
Could you explain what Loba Garifuna means and why you chose those two names?
Well, Loba in one of the castas is the mixture of, let me remember well. It's indigenous and, Garifuna is indigenous and African, and Loba is, I believe it's Morisca and indigenous. There are 16 of them, and they get very complicated. But I decided to make it, tri-ethnic and to give it that last name, and a last name that implies another caste, and to connect it to our form of social and class division. So to go to that place also of class. So it's not only the intersection of race and class.
And that is Loba Garifuna, what you see on your left.
Yeah. Well, one thing, if I may, right? Like, but I think this is also important to. There's also the power here of both the state, the empire, and the colonial space, right? Like, because the measurements that I was just indicating, there's a lot of this that is happening, right? Like in the world of private slave trade, there was a lot of smuggling, right? Like, but this is the inscription within the paperwork of the Spanish state. So it is also a very specific. This is the beginning of the 17th century. So it's before kind of the traditional kind of tracing of, for instance, the birth of biopolitics, of that sort of thing in description of the power of the state. I mean, you were thinking about castas also.
Right.
in many cases, they might not have been like deployed, right, like in the everyday practice, but they function in very powerful ways, precisely because they're associated with the part of the state. So I just wanted to point that out because it is measuring, but it's measuring in very specific circumstances and very specific spaces.
Right, and belonging to a caste also, it would allow you a job or not, or a place in society, status or none.
And also in the vision, right? Like
Right,
yeah.
right.
So right now, when you were talking about the administrative qualities, or the not qualities, but the administrative needs of the slave trade, and it's about insurance as well, because what you were showing us there, and I was hoping that you could elaborate a bit more, because these were insurance agencies that were insuring the bodies of the transatlantic slave trade. So numbers become very important. And as you said, it wasn't just, so they're creating categories like pieza de indias, which becomes the norm, and everyone's measured against that norm. But it's also about the potential loss of value. And so could you talk a little bit about the value of a human being at this time and how it loses value? And that also goes for you, Nancy, in terms of the value that you showed us, for example, in the vase, the changing chocolate, and the different extractive practices in Latin America.
So I'm thinking here, right, like in terms of the emergence of risk, right, like as a central, that is another kind of central category, right, like of the imagination of our world, right, like how do you measure risk around all sorts of things, right, like this is before the emergence really of what we will consider today insurance companies, right, like Lloyd's. I mean, although there is the work of Sasha White at Johns Hopkins that have shown how from the very beginning, Lloyd's, one of the first insurance companies in England, was actually very much involved in the slave trade, right? Like, what I'm showing here is that there are practices of risk evaluation and measurement that predate these, and they function around others of, there are very, very few insurance policies from the 16th and 17th century in these sorts of trips. But implied in the way in which they're planning their businesses, implied in the kind of the ways in which they're modeling, I didn't have a chance to show you, but there are like also calculations of mortality rates in places in Caribbean islands or in towns in the northern part of what today is Colombia. Say like, this is how many bodies of Black people will be consumed yearly, right? Like, so it is also thinking about how you associate colonial projects, the risk of the disease, the risk of death with financial gain. And that is the other thing that I want to make clear, right? Like, this is about money. This was taxation for the state, for the Spanish state. So the origins of these sort of ideas, it is part of the genealogy. It's not unique, but it's one that is very, very specifically related to a colonial extractivist project that is not even necessarily capitalistic in nature. That is the other thing. This is the merge of practices that were already in place in the Mediterranean world for several centuries, with the specific emergence of the need of long-distance trading and long-distance investment. So just going back to what you were asking, right? Like there are different sorts of hunting and different spectralities here that actually move our world, and that is the history that I think it becomes very, very important to kind of bring to light.
Nancy?
Well, I think I'll go back to your question about how the work takes place, because that is about it's connected to value. So in the works that you saw, Dream Map and Cornucopia, they are very large. They're 135 by 90. And I'm doing historical research, but my job as an artist is to take this historical data and make a bridge to a space of poetics. Mm-hmm. I'm more connected to, a poet than to an academic. And that the size of those works, they have an intention to take space, to be visible, to make something that has been debased and invisibilized, and to bring it to a place where it cannot be ignored, where it's in your face, and you can see that, you can see the value, you can see the narrative, and you can see the importance of the history. It's not so easy to walk by, and that's the intention of, and maybe answers the question of value too.
Absolutely. I have a question about immigration, but please.
I just wanted to mention something that really was striking also about your own work, Nancy, and it was your inspiration, and now I understand after the conversation of somebody who has been also kind of inspiring me for years, Manuel Zapata Olivella, who you mentioned. And Manuel Zapata Olivella
was
was
this person?
Manuel Zapata Olivella.
Okay.
For me, the most important Colombian novelist, Afro-Colombian novelist, he was also somebody who was a physician, right? But I was just thinking about like the sort of things that really kind of move and inspire and create kind of the possibilities for these works to emerge and to be seen. And Manuel Zapata Olivella was very good about that. He wrote some of the most important ethnographies, right, of the 20th century, but also he wrote about the 17th century historical novels, right, like La Chango El Gran Putas, Chambacu. So incredible works that are so important and has been so important for me. So I think that there is a very close relationship here. I'm so glad that I was just like, when I saw it, I was like completely blown away, right, how these worlds actually connect.